Thanks a lot. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing in Africa on credit markets. And like almost all of the LIFT projects, this is in partnership with a fintech company in Africa. In particular, it's a solar home company that realized that they could use the solar home system as digital collateral to give cash loans on top of it in a profitable way. And we're going to talk about what digital collateral is, its expansion, and why it's really providing a financially sustainable way to get credit to lower income populations in a way that really benefit them. And so let's see. Good. I learned how to use the technology. I feel unlike Richard Nixon for a moment now that we're at the anniversary of Watergate. In the countries we live in, or most of us, the standard or predominant source of credit is collateralized lending, which is you put up a physical asset, and if you default or you miss payments, the lender could take that asset away from you. In fact, in the US, more than 80% of debt is collateralized or secured. And collateral does a couple things. One is it incentivizes repayment. So you don't make strategic default. You don't decide, well, I'm just going to miss a payment for fun, or because I'd rather go out and in California spend money in the local weed dispensary. And it also prevents bad risks from applying for loans. So it solves both a moral hazard problem and an adverse selection problem. It's what makes credit markets really work in high income countries. The problem is, at least in low income countries, middle and low income countries, collateral is really much less widespread. It's used very rarely, and certainly not for the middle of the socioeconomic pyramid and down, for a number of reasons. One is, in lots of these countries, repossession costs of collateral are very, very high, and property rights are difficult to establish. So if you give a loan, it's collateralized, you go to the courts, there's some high probability the courts won't enforce those contracts. And so these issues make it hard for lenders to, if they do have collateralized loans, they end up using them very little. Second, there's a demand side issue, which a lot of the collateral that people could put up are related to essential assets or income generating assets. So if I put up my cow and I have a weather shock and I can't make my payment and my cow gets repossessed, my income generating base disappears. So lots of people in low and middle income countries are very reluctant to put up collateral for these loans. Okay, so what we look at in this project is a new form of secured lending that uses what we're calling digital collateral. It's an idea that was around for a while, but we're trying to claim credit for it by giving it a jazzy title. And what we're going to do is have a form of collateral which facilitates secured lending without repossession. And so what is digital collateral? It's facilitated by lockout technology. So you have some sort of electricity using asset, or you have, in the cases we're going to look at, you can put a chip on the battery so that it can be remotely disabled and not function if you miss a payment, and then it can be remotely and cheaply enabled if you start paying again. So if you have, say, a weather shock or an illness and you can't repay, well, you would lose a few days of solar light until you're able to start working and paying again. You don't lose the solar home system. And so it has a bunch of really nice properties. One is you don't lose your income generating asset through repossession. Two, the lender doesn't have to spend a lot of money or effort or time or rely on the courts to repossess a few days of service use of that asset. So I don't need to go to the courts to do it. I don't need a legal system, and I can do it remotely. Those of you who had their electricity or telephone shut off for non-repayment, you know what this is like, and then you go down and you start paying. And then this is reversible in the sense physical collateral repossession is not reversible, but this is reversible. You can turn it back on again. So it has a bunch of desirable properties. And so, in fact, collateral typically plays two roles. One, it's recovery. The lender gets something back of value if an individual defaults on the loans, and then it provides incentives in screening by taking something of value away from the borrowers. And in physical collateral, those two roles are bundled. In digital collateral, those two roles are separated. The lender doesn't get something back of value, but the incentives and screening still can be used. And so you can get, the idea is you can use this to get better repayment on the loan contracts and make these loans possible and profitable. And what's important about this, even though the borrower might pay a penalty of, say, lost days of light in the case of a solar home system, they get access to credit that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, because uncollateralized, unsecured credit in these economies are just astronomically expensive because of high default rates, and there's no secured lending. So the idea is this opens up credit markets to a whole class of individuals who wouldn't otherwise have it. Okay, so there are a bunch of examples in the real world. One is this PAYGO model for solar home systems. Phoenix is the company we've been working at. Smartphones, there's a company PayJoy, which uses the same model. Their subprime auto loans in the US can disable your car remotely if you don't pay. And utilities do this all the time to pay for, say, last mile connections or other asset purchases. And here's the Phoenix model. You buy one of these solar home systems, and you can see on the lower right, if you have one of these systems and you've paid it off in good standing, well, then you're eligible for a bunch of upgrades, including a school fee loan. Now, school fees have nothing to do with solar energy, but they're leveraging the fact you have this solar home system to give you follow-on loans for other purpose, and this becomes a profit center for the firm. And how it works is you buy your system, you get credit. Every day you use mobile money to pay your $2, and then you receive an SMS confirming your payment, and then it gives you a code. You put that code into your solar system, and if you miss payments, your system locks until you make a payment, and then you get it back on. This is PayJoy. This is off their website. You can get phone finance using this system, and you can also get cash loans leveraged off your telephone as an asset. If you miss payments, your phone locks until you start repaying it. This is the way PayJoy works. This is, since Mexico seems to be a country we're talking a lot about, this is credit offered by Telmex. You can get credit for computers, for a whole bunch of things, leveraged off your telephone. If you miss a payment, they cut off your telephone, or they cut off your internet until you start paying again. Okay, so in this project, we asked a bunch of questions. How valuable are these loans secured with digital collateral? In other words, we're going to quantify the effect on repayment and profitability. What's the mechanism? Reducing strategic default versus screening. And then what are the impacts of the loans on households? So unlike yesterday, what we're going to try and do is not only ask, are loans profitable and are people are getting them, but do these loans actually improve the welfare of households? And we're going to see these loans are actually used to pay for schools. So we see increase in enrollment and increases in expenditure per kid without having detrimental effects on the household's balance sheet. Okay, so obviously, Dan, I'm going to take more than 1 minute. So, and I'm going to use that as a prerogative because I'm your boss. Okay, so we do this field experiment with Phoenix, which is a solar home company in Uganda. The product is a loan between 25 and $125. You can get it up to 3 times a year during the school year. During the year, there are 3 terms for school. You put down a deposit. It has a 100-day maturity, and if you're delinquent, the device locks until you start paying again. And here you see on the left is household income over the 4 months of a school term, primary school expenditures, secondary school expenditures, and the size of the loan. And what I want to point out is the loan is a non-trivial share of income over that period, but it helps you finance a good portion of the school fees. We use a method to sort out the effect of secured loans on repayment rates and how much of that is due to the moral hazard effect, the incentive effect, versus adverse selection, the screening effect. This is the experimental design, which I'm going to use the old Professor Jedijczyk of proof by intimidation, flash this by you without letting you see it, and then you believe I did it right. Now here are the repayment rates. The vertical axis is the days into the loan, right? So 50 days, 100 day, 150. And the vertical axis is the fraction of the principal that's been repaid. And so that climbs up to the vertical blue bar, which is if you paid on time, that's when you would have fully paid off the loan. And you see it rises quite up. The red line is the total effect. And the orange line is the difference between the red line and the green line is the effect of digital credit at a point in time. So if you look at 100 days, it's a pretty large effect. And here you see on loan completion, look at 200 days. If you're unsecured, only about half of the loans are fully paid off. But if you have collateralized loans, it's close to 20 percentage points more. So it increases by about 40% the repayment rate. I won't go into this table, but the profitability of the secured loans doubles over the negative profitability of the unsecured loans. Here's the effect on schooling. Enrollment goes up significantly by 6 percentage points. And on the right-hand side, school expenditures go up by about 30%. There are no balance sheet effects. And so Dan, now I'll finish for you. New loan products that use lockout technology to digitally secure loans. Well, what we've seen is that this digital collateral greatly increases repayment rates and profitability and greatly expands the availability of credit to lower income populations. And there's pretty strong evidence, at least in this case, that the loan for schooling was highly welfare improving without being detrimental to the household balance sheet. And I'll stop there.
Yes, I have a question and a comment. The question is for Paul. So I was trying to find other examples where you can find this unique relationship between digital collateral and a loan. And it's difficult to find another good example of it because you have utilities but they have a unique relationship if you pay or you cannot pay. So I was thinking probably the retail industry, where they give you, like Macy's, they give you a credit line, and then you can buy shirts, you can buy shoes, but if you don't pay, they say, okay, you don't have access to your credit line. So what would be other examples that we can think of about this? That's the question. And the comment, I really like Ulrich's paper, because sometimes, or probably most of the times, there are really nice ideas that look good on a paper, but they are really bad at the end of the day. So I remember one reform in Chile from Congress people that says, you know what, we have to avoid charging interest over interest. In our community, this is compound interest. And they say we should eliminate that, get rid of that in the financial system. And I said, it looks like a good idea, but it's not, because what is going to happen is that banks are going to increase interest rates, and that's it. So I really like that we can have evidence to avoid this type of mistakes in the future.
So I think the big examples are the large expansion of electricity using assets that can be remotely disabled. So we worked with solar home systems, but PayJoy's using smartphones, and hundreds of millions of people have smartphones. And so you can use that as an example to provide loans for other things. So think of the solar home systems, the smartphones as the source of digital collateral, and then you get a loan for some other purpose, and then you pay it off. And so PayJoy's been giving hundreds of thousands of these loans in 9 countries where they offer. And it's, I think what makes this work is the fact that you can easily and cheaply and remotely turn off, on or off the flow. I think it's harder with a line of credit at retail unless you can, it might work, but you know, smartphones and these other assets so are really expanding very, very broadly within the economies that we're working with.
So I had a quick question for Paul. I guess one of the things I was struck by is the repayment rates are actually quite low overall. I think even, you know, even when everything's collateralized and, you know, certainly relative to like a traditional microfinance product. And I was just wondering if you've like had conversations with the firm in terms of why that might be, or whether or not they could better leverage like kind of historical data on, you know, kind of payment and interaction with the system to improve targeting of the loan offers themselves, because they seem sort of unprofitable almost.
Well, a couple things. One is they're already using information from the solar home system. So how many days did you miss payments? How many days of lost lights to condition on whether or not you give loans? And for this experiment, we actually asked them to drop their lower limit to get more risky people in there. And that's why the internal rate of returns were negative. At the bottom line, you had the IRRs for the regular product at the credit limits, at the risk rating limits that made you eligible, and those were very profitable. What we wanted to do was see, did the IRR improve when you had the secure loan with digital credits? And it went up by about 40 percentage points, so, or 40%. So they do take advantage of all the data they have. Now, this is also a selected sample, which is you already had to have bought the asset and typically used a pay-go contract for that. And you have to successfully finished off that loan in order to be eligible for this. So that's already a first set of selection. Now, from the standpoint of the product, that's actually pretty good because you got good risks in this pool, that you basically then can provide follow-on loans using the asset to provide digital collateral. And we're working, actually, I think David is still here. Now what we're doing is we're experimenting with different types of contracts using this collateral. So the contract we used here was you can start repaying, you can get your service back just by starting to repay again. Another model, which is arrears, which is you have to clean up all of your missed payments before you get your service back. That's a much stricter contract. And so we have a model which, thinks of this as the repossession rate. And the way this contract is the least restrict. If you move it towards the arrears model, that increases the strictness, and then physical repossession, where it's not reserved, is the stricted. So, and we don't know how those contracts are going to work, because on one hand, the arrears model has stronger incentives for repayment, but you have many fewer people who want to take that up. And so we're experimenting with these different types of contracts now with the same company